Good evening again and welcome. My name is Elise Waterston and I have the great privilege and honor of introducing Monica Heller this evening for her presidential address. But before I provide my formal introduction to Monica, I'd like to extend a special thanks. I'd like all of us to extend a special thanks to Monica for her amazing grace under fire, her beautiful poise and presence running the meeting last night. Thank you so much, Monica. You just got a standing ovation. Monica Heller, our gracious leader, our brilliant colleague, our great internationalist, my dear friend. Over the past 2 years, I have had the absolute pleasure and good fortune to watch Monica up front and close as she served all of us as the 83rd president of the American Anthropological Association. This is a 24/7 position that requires vigilance, grace under fire, confidence, an open mind, fearlessness, big shoulders, intelligence and thoughtfulness, sensitivity, awareness, knowledge, and deep commitment to anthropology, to fellow anthropologists, and to the association. Monica has all these attributes. By means of her day in and day out labor of love with the work of the association, Monica has made an enormously positive mark on what we do and how we do it, and on how the world looks upon our discipline and its possibilities. To prepare for this short introduction to her presidential address, I asked Monica to send me her CV. You may be well aware of her important work in linguistic anthropology on the dialectics of language and power, politics, economy, the social, and the cultural. You may know of her ethnographic studies of Francophone Canadians, or her work in social justice education, or her cogent argument about bilingualism, how the notion of it is deeply ideological, and how it is a socially and politically constituted language practice. Or you may know her thesis on how language processes and practices shape group dynamics and social relations within the nation state. Or you may know of her commitment to the idea and the fact of social process as central to understanding language and interaction as fields for the exercise of relations of power. You may know that Monica's critical linguistic approach connects language to larger processes of globalization, the post-nationalist economy, transnationalism, and the multiplicity of movements, migrations, circulations, contestations, and identities characteristic of the contemporary moment. You may not know that Monica, with her colleagues in linguistic anthropology, has a brand new book just published titled Sustaining the Nation, The Making and Moving of Language and Nation, which asks a central question for our times. What happens when identities produced by the nation state encounter numerous kinds of global flows, some of which produce those identities and some of which challenge them? You may not know that Monica's CV is 57 pages long, a document that lists our Monica's great scholarly accomplishments. Monica's home base is the University of Toronto, where she has a cross-appointment in the Department of Anthropology and the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. She is only the second of all our AAA presidents who is neither American nor based in the US. She has built on the work of her predecessors, including Setha Lowe, Virginia Dominguez, and Leith Mullings, and with many of our sister associations across the globe, to help us move beyond narrow borders and boundaries to expand our connection with world anthropologies, an effort consistent with her understanding that we are all engaged in global, transnational circuits, even as there are very real and identifiable constraints that inhibit their flow. Monica has helped pave the way, has helped liberate all of us. For me, the most rewarding part of the experience of AAA leadership work is the great people we get to collaborate with and get to know. I feel lucky to have had this chance to get to know Monica as a leader, as a scholar, and as a true friend who is open and accessible and caring, and I'm getting teary, and considerate. She is a real mensch. Professor Monica Heller, it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you to the podium so that we may hear your presidential address titled Dr. Esperanto.
I hate it when people make me cry when I'm supposed to talk. So, one of my esteemed colleagues once suggested to me that an anthropological exploration of language is akin to studying the tail rather than the dog. Within linguistic anthropology, studying so-called artificial languages like Esperanto is often equally understood as peripheral. This evening, however, I'll examine the ways in which the subject throws into relief debates and tensions within some of anthropology's long-standing central questions. What, if anything, does it mean to be distinctively human? What is the relative importance of commonality or even universality on the one hand, and difference or diversity on the other? What is the proper and possible scope of human agency in addressing these questions? In particular, what is the role of science and of the scientist? What might it mean for anthropology to, quote unquote, help solve human problems, as our association's tagline would have it? Dr. Esperanto suggests that perhaps one answer to these questions lies in the imagining of alternative worlds. But he also suggests that those need to remain plural, lest we invest so much in particular worlds that we can no longer balance the shared and the different, the familiar and the strange. That is, that we can no longer see their contradictions and their unintended effects. So let's start by understanding anthropology as being about imagining alternative worlds. But that field is full of tensions. Those tensions include imagining those worlds as perfect versus imperfect, imagining their form as divine, natural, or made by the rational intervention of beings in this world, so-called human or otherwise, imagining them so as to make this one better versus just getting to know it well, imagining them so as to address radical difference versus establishing commonality. Which of these facets and tensions come to the fore, and for whom, has everything to do with the nature of struggles in this world. And this is true also of how we as anthropologists engage them. Seeing that, I hope, will give us a better handle on the complexity and indeterminacy of our work, that is, of the alternative worlds we imagine. I won't be able to do this talk in a strictly linear way, and not just because this is the Mile High Ballroom. So rather than give you an outline, let me give you an image. Come on, you're supposed to work. This happen? There we go. So think about the top one, top polyhedron, as the multifaceted and dynamically tension-filled anthropology as imagining alternative worlds. Now think of the top one as being in motion. As it moves through time and space, different facets come to the fore. And maybe the number and shape and size of the facets change, as in, say, the second and the third. So as we go along, and political economic conditions change, different facets of the tensions involved in imagining alternative worlds will become salient. I'll use the specific field of artificial languages to explore what it has meant and still means to do anthropology in this way. I'll situate IALs, as I will mainly call them, within the contradictions of capitalism, in particular, the contradiction between its promise that its benefits can be shared versus the struggles over the inequalities it in fact creates. It pits the hope for a future equitable and therefore peaceful world against the goal of winning conflicts in this present one. It puts in the center the possibility that rational human intervention can be effective on any and all of these fronts, although by doing so, it also brings us to some questions. Does rational human action depend on an understanding of natural laws, that is, processes outside of human control, or can it be fully autonomous? Put differently, is language part of nature and humanity's membership in it, or is it a uniquely human technique for acting on the world? For what we think language is reveals much about who we think we are and what we think we're doing here. And indeed, we've been asking ourselves that question for millennia, using the idea of the perfect language to explore our connection to the divine or to nature, to ask whether we share a common and distinctive humanity or not, and also to make better spyware and more recognizable emojis. Those preferences also leave us in various places in terms of being more or less interested in understanding ourselves or others, whether to make alliances or to compete with each other. A better world might be one in which we are all equal or even exactly the same. It might also be one in which important differences are recognized and respected. It might be one in which we all coexist, or it might be one in which the enemy, whoever that may be, is vanquished. Finally, where we stand on those questions leads us to look perhaps for the core of what we all share, perhaps for ways to make ourselves or the other intelligible, perhaps to close off the ones from the others. Most importantly, for my purposes, these varying stances are not distinct. One can shift easily, maybe too easily, from one to the other, and even occupy all at once, according to the circumstances. Our interest does wax and wane, and which facets become salient do the same. There are reasons why we're interested at any given moment or any given place in showing either common humanity or even commonality across humans and other life forms, or sharp differences, or in arguing that we should accept natural order versus arguing that we can, indeed we must, make a better world. Those reasons have to do, I believe, with political economy, and in the specific bit of the story I'll be telling you, with the ties among capitalism, colonialism, and the nation-state, and the contradictions they contain. I think the story of invented languages helps us grasp the shape-shifting dimension of the imagining of alternative worlds that is, I want to argue, the specialty of anthropology. The same two ideas have been used to try to solve all kinds of issues. Either we think we'll solve human problems by finding a way to communicate clearly across difference, or we think we'll do so by embracing the incommensurability of difference. Sometimes we think both are true at once. But not everyone involved has always agreed, either on the ways or the issues, and efforts have often had perverse effects. This is then both a hopeful and a cautionary tale. Wish, but be careful what you wish for, anthropology. Imagine, but watchfully. So let me start my story proprement dit. It starts out as a very European story, then it jumps to Asia and North America, and now it's all over the place, including other planets, albeit admittedly imaginary ones. In this respect, it largely follows the path of political and economic power. I'll start with a moment of explosion of European interest in this invented language thing, the late 19th century, which not coincidentally is the crucible linking modernity, colonialism, nation-states, and capitalism. This is where the authority of the divine cedes to the struggle between the authority of nature and the authority of human agency and will. It's where the promises of democracy come up against the inequalities of capitalism, where the discourse of universal rights encounters social differences in the shape of nations, races, gender, and class. Invented languages emerge from that crucible. The story is usually told as a struggle between the first such language to really take off, Volapük, first published in Germany in 1879, and its successor, Esperanto, though, as we shall see, this struggle was merely the precursor for what became a much more complicated and therefore illuminating set of debates around an explosion of candidate constructed languages numbering into the thousands and continuing in the present. Volapük, which I'm fond of because it has lots of front rounded vowels like U or Ö, as well as the umlauts to show for it, can be understood as the last of the religious attempts to touch the divine and spread the word of God through touching the orderly core of language. Ooh, no. So here we have Johannes Schleyer on your left. So the authority of the inventor, the authority of Volapük, followed the hierarchy of religious institutions, which is not surprising that its inventor on the left, Johannes Schleyer, was a Protestant minister. I'd like you to notice, please, the facial hair. In the struggle with Esperanto, Volapük was eclipsed for two reasons: because Schleyer was loath to give up authority on Volapük's shape, and because of exactly those umlauts I love so much. A language which pretended to order and cleanliness couldn't have what is referred to in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy as fiddly-bits. That was in reference to the coastline of Norway's fjords, but no matter. So both of these questions, authority and fiddly-bits, were to dog the debate for decades, indeed now for over a century. These are often presented in the literature as examples of how petty four-eyed intellectuals can get, but I think there's more to it than that. The authority debate gets at the heart of ideological quarrels over whether language is natural and should be left to its own devices, or at least to those of its users, or whether it's a technical tool to be perfected by experts and left to its perfection. It pits the laws of nature against the laws of humans, and then it pits the experts against each other. And the same debates apply to the notion of culture, of course. The fiddly-bits debate gets at whether what's best for the planet, or anyway its inhabitants, or anyway some of them, is what feels close and fuzzy and familiar, or what is purest and cleanest. Together they ask, better for whom, better how? Esperanto made its entry in July 1887 when a 28-year-old Jewish oculist living in Warsaw, and you see him on your right, sent a 40-page pamphlet around. Notice, please, on your right, the facial hair, but also the green star on the lapel, and the green star will become important. So he sent out a 40-page pamphlet setting out the principles for a new universal language to as many people as he could. There we go. So this is the pamphlet. He sent it around to as many people as he could think of who might be interested. The pamphlet, written in Russian, German, Polish, and French, was called simply Dr. Esperanto's International Tongue, and it was later referred to as the first book, since the grammar kept getting revised or perfected. So here you have a few first editions of what is called the Unua Libro. While the author revealed his real name in the mailing address he enclosed for return of coupons by hoped-for enthusiasts, he signed his title and introduction Doctoro Esperanto. In the language he was describing, this means Doctor Hoping. And of course, as we know, Esperanto became the name of the language he invented. He himself was many different things. Dr. Esperanto, and also Leser or Ludwig or LL Zamenhof with an S, as in German, or Zamenhof with a Z, Jewish and German and Russian and Polish all at once. And I'm deeply empathetic to this. My first name has a ghost K, my middle name has 3 versions, one of which has nothing to do linguistically with the other 2, and my last name has 2 versions, one of which you might be familiar with from the TV series Friends. So this is relevant to his interest in the matter in the first place. So this is out of the English translation 2 years later of the Unua Libro. And yet, though language is the prime motor of civilization, and to it alone we owe the having raised ourselves above the level of other animals, difference of speech is a cause of antipathy, nay, even of hatred between people, as being the first thing to strike us on meeting. Not being understood, we keep aloof, and the first notion that occurs to our mind is not to find out whether the others are of our own political opinions, or whence their ancestors came from thousands of years ago, but to dislike the strange sound of their language. Anyone who has lived for a length of time in a commercial city, whose inhabitants were of different unfriendly nations, will easily understand what a boon would be conferred on mankind by the adoption of an international idiom, which, without interfering with domestic affairs or the private life of nations, would play the part of an official and commercial dialect, at any rate in countries inhabited by people of different nationalities. This is certainly a cri du cœur from a Jew growing up in multilingual Bialystok under Russian and then Polish-Russian authority at the end of the 19th century. We see how he experiences what seems to be the immutability of social difference under the rubric of the concept of nations or nationalities as a fault line for competition over political, Zamenhof uses the term official, and economic, in his terms, commercial resources, all while he himself shape-shifts his way through the minefield. We see the city emerging as the place where these stakes are highest and tensions potentially most explosive. What's his solution? The application of Enlightenment values of rationality as a means to impose order, and not coincidentally peace, on the simmering cauldron of hostility. Let's be clear, Esperanto was never intended to replace other languages. It was therefore not meant to be the original or divine language that others had long sought over the centuries. Instead, it was meant as what is commonly called an international auxiliary language, that is, an easy language everyone can pick up to talk to each other without going through the contortions of learning real languages or fighting over who learns whose. Indeed, Esperanto was only one of about 400 such languages cooked up between 1875 and 1925, to be followed by as many as another 300 in the following 50 years. Lots of linguistic, logical philosophy, and mathematician heavyweights were involved, too, from Ferdinand de Saussure's brother René, to the logician Rudolf Carnap, to Otto Jespersen, a Danish linguist, Hugo Schuhart, a Romance philologist from Vienna, and our own Edward Sapir. In many ways, we're still at it, what with Klingon and so on. Indeed, one of our members, Christine Schreier, has been helping Hollywood invent languages. She invented Kryptonian for the 2013 movie Man of Steel, and she can tell you anything you want to know about Na'vi from Avatar. And don't get me started on Dothraki. Come on. So these are some examples of the invented orthographies for some of these languages. And here are some of the speakers, Klingon, Na'vi, and Dothraki speakers, and please again note the distribution of facial hair. As the historian of science, Michael Gordon, points out, however, there is a reason so many hundreds of IALs get invented, and why so many people get hot under the collar about them. The central one is that they bring together the core contradictions of industrial capitalism and its relation to empire and the nation state. IALs were supposed to bring peace to a fragmented world, appealing to our common humanity over our cultural differences. But in this, they failed to account for the harsh realities of nations as markets, and of the idea of cultural difference as a means to legitimize social inequalities inherent in imperial and capitalist modes of production. This peacemaking side of IALs attracted, for example, Tokyo Oyama, a child of a Japanese colonial official in Korea, who in 1922 took up the cause of Esperanto in that colony, hoping to reduce tensions arising from the imposition of Japanese. But it also attracted the utopians, the dreamers, draped in the green for hope of the Esperanto movement, with stars on their clothing and in their eyes. So you'll remember the green star on Zamenhof's lapel, and here we have the green star behind Madame Esperanto. And so notice not only the green star, notice also the distribution of facial hair, which tells you something about peace and hostility. Such displays, bolstered eventually by Zamenhof's own turn to increasing spiritualism, really bothered the scientists and the economic developers. And of course, green is also the color of envy, but we're not going to go there. The two shared interests beyond modernist ideas of human progress. They shared concerns about international competition over access to industrial technology, raw materials, and labor, given the increasingly globalized nature of scientific knowledge, and competition at the time among Germany, France, and Britain, joined eventually by the United States, for control also over the production of scientific knowledge, as well, of course, control over its applications in industry and war. For example, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Japan both sent students to Germany for scientific training and tried to develop Esperanto as a way to develop Japanese science on a more level playing field than the one Europe was currently offering. Work on these fronts throughout the 20th century was supported not only by states, including their military and foreign policy wings, but also by private philanthropists, notably the American Alice Vanderbilt Morris in the mid-20th century, and often US private foundations such as Ford and Rockefeller, especially during the Cold War. There's a lot to say, unsurprisingly, about gender here, with peace and understanding understood and often embodied as feminized, and so-called scientific truth as masculinized. There's more to say about that, but I won't do that here. The scientists largely took front stage in debates on IAL starting in the early 20th century. They looked to them as a terrain for their search for the kind of rational analysis of language scientists were seeking to apply to the rest of the natural world. Certainly, they argued that their own views of what an IAL might be were more legitimate than those of lay people like Zamenhof, simply because of the, to them, greater moral value of scientific objectivity over and against personal charisma and spiritual utopianism. But there was more. For some, what mattered most was social practice, making a language that would be easy to learn and to use. Some thought this required setting it free to become whatever its users might do with it, though others, like Edward Sapir, thought that likely this would simply mean that it would evolve or develop according to the ways in which languages and presumably cultures all evolved, according to objectively observable natural laws. Tensions around the best way to use IALs as a step towards intercultural understanding and multilingualism manifested themselves in Alice Vanderbilt Morris's Interlingua project based in New York. Her goals, that is to make an interlingua, as she called it, that would principally help people learn other languages, came up against those of her scientific directors, notably Sapir in the early 1930s and André Martinet, the central figure in French structural linguistics, in the late 1940s. I would argue that we see these tensions at work today within and among linguistics, applied linguistics, and linguistic anthropology, in parallel to our discussions, say, about applied practicing or some other kind of anthropology. More implicitly, they underlie our silences around what it means to learn a field language or otherwise become communicatively competent to undertake empirical work in any of our subfields. Among the scientists, debates shifted ground over time. Earlier ones, as we saw, gave weight to problems of orthography, principally regarding whether or not diacritics, those fiddly bits we usually call accents in lay language, were optimal. They linked these to problems of clean and rational structural systems of sound and word shape, largely agreeing that syntax should be a matter of sequencing. Between the wars, debates focused more around linguistic categories. One branch focused on vocabulary, or what we were taught in grad school to refer to as the lexicon, searching for a core of words that would be optimal because they would be the most widely shared among existing so-called natural languages. Sapir, for example, felt, and I should have this, that a highly efficient and maximally simple international language needs to be developed, which capitalizes for common purposes the stock of words and grammatical techniques which lie scattered about in the more important of the national languages of Europe. One can maybe think of this as a form of linguistic DNA with all of the ideological problems attendant upon such a concept. These attempts also drew on a long tradition in historical linguistics, which divides languages into family trees, with daughters understood to have evolved over time from mothers. If you could establish the lexical content of the original language from which today's languages evolved, the thinking went, you would have a better chance of mutual intelligibility today. You would also, by the way, have discovered, or perhaps invented, the languages our common ancestors spoke, and that's a project inherited from an even more ancient philological tradition. To my knowledge, no one claimed any divine origin or authority anymore. The historical evolutionary approach also had its counterpart in regards to morphosyntax, or the ways bits of meaning make relations amongst each other. 19th century evolutionary linguists, especially Wilhelm von Humboldt, had already argued that analytic languages were more civilized than synthetic ones. To cruelly oversimplify, he argued that it was more sophisticated to separate out bits of meaning than to attach them to each other. And in that, he and his followers were particularly fascinated at the time by Chinese. So we weren't the first ones. While not everyone held to the same strictly evolutionary model, many thought nonetheless that IALs should rely on what was alternatively thought of as naturally logical or scientifically logical relations among bits of meaning, let's call them words. Conversely, if the inventor of one got it right, an IAL could be understood to represent a model of natural order, of cognitive structures, or of pure abstract logic, or perhaps all of the above. For Sapir, the goal of research on constructed languages should be, and here's a second quote, to give the whole question of linguistic form a thorough logical and psychological overhauling, and to make references to national and proposed international languages only in the most incidental way as illustrative of the various fundamental points that can be made. Part of my point here is that IALs were understood to be fruitful terrains for thinking through the fundamentals not only of linguistic theory per se, but of how language related to human cognition, social relations, nature, and historical change. While Sapir, Jespersen, and later Martinet were probably the most invested of the many linguists and anthropologists in the field, they weren't alone. So here, for example, is the IAL Manifesto of 1925, signed by, among others, Franz Boas, you'll recognize him. The guy without the facial hair is Edmund Sapir, and the woman is Alice Vanderbilt Morris. Interestingly though, at least to me, Esperanto turned out to be even more polysemic than that. Others found in it a helpful response to the class tensions of industrial capitalism. You see this watch? I've got one on the slide for you in case you can't see the one I'm wearing. Esperanto was introduced into Switzerland in the 1890s, where it appealed to Swiss interest in political neutrality. It also appeared as a brand element in one of Switzerland's signature industries, watchmaking. Esperanto's internationalism and rationality were harnessed to clean, modern design by a Jewish watchmaker, Achille Dittesheim. Dittesheim, originally from the German side of the Rhine, founded a watch company with his brothers in 1881 in La Chaux-de-Fonds, the heart of the Swiss watch manufacturing region of the Jura Mountains. We should note that this was the year after the last conference of the Fédération Jurassienne, an anarchist organization, and that the region had been an important theater of tensions between followers of Marx and followers of Bakunin the previous 15 years or so, in the context of a long tradition of workers' movements in the region. Dittesheim gave his new company a fairly typical company name for the period, LAI Dittesheim et Frères, and Brothers. In 1905, the same year as the first major international conference of Esperantists, he changed the name to Movado. Other companies quickly followed suit, perhaps the best known of which are Rado, which means wheel, and Eterna. You can probably figure out yourselves what that one means. Certainly, 1905 was the height of the Esperantist movement, but it was also a moment of development of socialism and communism, for whom IALs represented a possible path towards international worker solidarity. It was taken up in the early years of the Soviet Union as a means to conduct the struggle for workers' rights as a properly international phenomenon. It also competed with other so-called novlangs in the making of the new socialist society. It wasn't until much later under Stalin that Esperanto would be repudiated. I see that as a move symptomatic of dilemmas of empire, nationalism, and internationalism that were scarcely peculiar to the Soviet Union. Chinese communists were interested in Esperanto in the 1930s and 40s. The Nazis, those hyper-modern, hyper-nationalists, of course, feared and repressed it. In Switzerland, from the watch industry's perspective, perhaps, it allowed also for the mobilization of a semiosis of technical prowess. If we can make a language, believe me, we can make a watch. Movado and Rado and Eterna form a nexus in which all the contradictions of modernity manifest themselves. Progress and inequality, national essence, why buy a watch that isn't Swiss, and internationalism, technical skill and authenticity, reason and emotion, all right there in my watch. And these discursive elements and contradictions remain with us today even as English rose to global dominance and became itself the terrain for struggles over who owns it, how best to learn it, whether it can be appropriated freely, or whether it always belongs to the so-called native speaker. At the same time, the notion of a structural core which would facilitate translation and language learning was, for example, taken up, often via IALs themselves, in World War II and during the Cold War, as a basis for machine translation projects and their offspring, computational linguistics. Rather than work at inventing a language to be used by people, scientists turned to languages to be used by computers to mediate amongst languages for a wide variety of state and corporate, political, and economic goals. And I'm looking at you, Google Translate. We might include here activities as diverse as espionage, delivery of health services to a multilingual population, or the management of global companies. The project also remains relevant to the search for the truth about language as a universal human capacity. So see, for example, the work of Noam Chomsky and the goal of generative linguistics, or to decide whether beings we usually consider non-human share this capacity with us. This, I think, echoes some of our contemporary concerns around the arrogance of the Anthropocene. A quick look at the Movado website today shows that Esperanto and its modernist discursive elements remain part of the brand. Movado, modern ahead of its time. Its collection includes a large number of Esperanto names: Amorosa, Bella, Ciclo, Luma, Rondiro, and Verto, for example. And Pace Movado, I don't think it was modern ahead of its time. It was modern at its time, which is still ours in so many ways. Lately, the European Union has gained renewed interest in Esperanto as the number of languages spoken by its member states grows. Its practice, of course, has been to rely on a small army of interpreters and translators to handle international communication among member states, given that, just as was the case 100 years ago, no one is prepared to let German or French or, heaven forbid, English emerge as the common language. But a system that worked for 6, 12, even 20 member states has become unwieldy. Which then is best? Accepting English and trying to appropriate it as some kind of world language belonging to everyone equally? Or turning back to good old Esperanto, or Novial, Ido, or Latine sine flexione? Walking down a Paris street in 2013, my eye caught this sign, a bit of a surprise among the usual street sticker fare in European cities. Lately, people have been observing that emojis are taking over from English, at least English abbreviations, in international text messaging. They notice that sequencing, as in IALs, is used to string bits of meaning together, and on that basis, wonder if perhaps we're inventing a new international language. Last May, the New York Times published a piece by Mike Isaac, who says, "Emoji, however inelegant as they may seem, have become a language of their own, a way to transcend the limits of one's native tongue to communicate with others worldwide. This surge is perhaps best illustrated across Instagram, the immensely popular photo-sharing app that Facebook owns. Nearly 40% of all text posted to Instagram contains at least one emoji in the photo caption, according to the company. In some countries, like Finland, that number climbs to more than 63%. In much of Europe, emoji are present in more than half of all Instagram captions." I'm still in the quote. Instagram found that as emoji use rose across the app, the use of internet slang formed from English letters went down, and that the two phenomena were strongly correlated. That could explain why you may be seeing fewer instances of LOL on Instagram photo captions, while smiley face emoji are becoming more prevalent. "It's a rare privilege to observe the rise of a new language," Thomas Stimson, a software engineer on Instagram's data team, said. "Emoji," he says, "are becoming a valid and near-universal method of expression in all languages." The emoji string on the bottom was not from the New York Times. That was me trying to see if I could make an emoji sentence. And anybody who can figure out what I'm trying to say gets an emoji text message from me afterwards. IALs also show up in the imagining of alternative worlds in science fiction, so we need to add Hollywood to our list of who pays for this work. The languages need to be credible according to some set of criteria which reveal what we think language is. Can aliens speak it? Does that make them eerily like us? Do we want to understand them? Today, IALs are usually referred to as constructed languages, or conlangs, and are perhaps the linguistic partners to cosplay. The web is full of sites for conlangers, most of them focused on the mechanics of how to construct a language, thereby begging an analysis of what we are constructing those languages for. I think Dr. Esperanto was much clearer about his goals. I would argue that they remain echoes of the promise of human agency in making a better world, or at least one that we can control. IALs even get used, kinda, to market other cultural products. Last December, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation broadcast a spoof report claiming that a small economically depressed town in southern Alberta had decided to invent a dialect in order to attract tourists. This is not as weird as it sounds. We have increasing numbers of language museums around the world, and local dialects do get used to attract tourists, as close to me anyway as Newfoundland and Labrador. And this is a quote and a screen capture from a campaign by the Newfoundland and Labrador Tourism Bureau. And there's lots of those. You should, if you're interested in this, you should go navigate their website. Here, though, it's the exotic and distinctive that has value, not the common core. We look for worlds different from our own, and often in so doing, we still take up Zamenhof's hope that that world will be a better, more equitable place. We may not be able always to inhabit it, but we would like, nonetheless, to be a welcome visitor. So the dream never dies, at least not yet, in what is proving to be a very long 20th century indeed, unless perhaps it's still the 19th, which strikes me as equally plausible. It does, however, founder consistently on its own dreaminess as much as on the harsh realities it must, of necessity, confront. To make it visitable these days, we need to do things like tourism, or maybe anthropology. Someone needs to make intelligibility, but who profits and who loses out remain part of the realities of how we make our way in the world. And we constantly juggle the balance between the shared and the distinct, between the familiar and the strange. Let me end with a story which is supposed to be a legend brought from out of the mists of the French past to what is now Canada by the settlers of New France. Though, of course, maybe it might have been made up by Honoré Beaugrand, the writer whose version made it popular in a publication in 1900. Called La Chasse-Galerie, it tells of woodsmen off cutting down trees in the forest to feed the insatiable appetite of industrial capitalism. Their cook claims to hold the magic formula that will allow them to briefly escape this unpleasant, exploited existence by causing their canoe to rise up in the air and fly them back to their village home, where they can spend a few pleasant hours with their sweethearts. The condition, because there's always a condition, is that they must not swear, and they must be back by the start of work the next day, or the devil will take them and their canoe away forever. But this story is not Cinderella. The guys do get the canoe to fly home, but the experience is not uniformly delightful. One girlfriend, for instance, turns out to have fallen for a rival in the meantime. They figured they'd better get back to the lumber camp anyway, but needless to say, some of them have had a bit too much to drink, and swearing happens. They lose control of the canoe and run into a tree. And then they wake up the next morning and walk back to camp. As with all legends, you can read this one in many different ways. But let me pull out some ways that I can turn to my purpose. First, it is absolutely possible to imagine and transport yourself to an alternative world. On the other hand, that world might turn out to have some surprises in it. In addition, the act of transportation might have unexpected consequences. But the whole endeavor will be transformative, teaching us things we would never have learned otherwise. Well, anyway, here's hoping. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Monica. That was wonderful. Can I have a copy? That was really great, and it was fascinating to watch the transcription and how It was translated. Yes. So now I get another treat, and that is to give you a couple of gifts. One is this plaque. Although now I have to get my glasses on. I'm sorry if I'm going to read it out loud because I can't see what it says. Presented to Monica Heller in recognition of her steadfast commitment to the mission of the American Anthropological Association and for her distinguished contribution to its program and services as president 2013 to 2015 and as president-elect 2011 to 2013, presented in Denver, Colorado at the 114th annual meeting this 20th day of November 2015. Monica. And now, another little present for you, Monica. And this is from all of us in the association. And something very much well-deserved, a day at the spa. And you better use it. Thank you very much for coming.
We're not over.
We're not?
No,
oh, right, I
Liz.
forgot. I was trying to avoid this part.
Sorry, no, not so fast. So this is an exchange ritual. It's the passation des pouvoirs. This is the moment at which I hand over the symbol of the presidency, which this is exactly what I used last night. Yes. So it's got good mojo.
Yes.
To you, in welcoming you to the presidency, you are so ready and you are going to be so fantastic.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Do I bang it?
Yes, you do.
Thank you. Thank you, Monica. Mwah. And now we could say,
Now we can say
good
goodbye.
night, let's party.